Thank you everyone for joining us today for this training. It's so nice to see some familiar names in the chat. We'll start off with a round of intros. We're excited to be with you all, and I can kick us off. My name is Jessica Jewell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the digital director at the Water Hub. And I'm going to self-describe how I look in case there are folks with low vision here with us today. I identify as a multiracial person. I'm half Colombian and have some Celtic ancestry as well. I have long curly hair and I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt with stripes on it. And I will pass it off to Ayana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ayana Harskoet. My pronouns are they, them. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York on Lenape land. And yeah, for folks who are listening in or with low vision, I'm an East Asian and white biracial non-binary person. I'm also the communications associate at River Network, and we are an organization that connects and strengthens the national network of water, justice, and river advocates. So hopefully you all. And a huge part of that is creating resources like the ones we're sharing today. And I'll pass it off to Tina.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here with y'all today. My name is Tina Lee. I'm the Senior Manager of Digital Data Analytics at Climate Nexus. I use she, her pronouns and am based in Colorado on Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. I am East Southeast Asian, have long dark hair and am wearing glasses and a collared black shirt.
Nice. So again, like Ayana was mentioning, today we are sharing some top lines from both our guides from the River Network and the Water Hub. One is the Digital Accessibility Guide, and then River Network's amazing Inclusive Communications and Digital Accessibility Guide. So there's a lot more in both of these and recommend that y'all check them out. We'll also drop links to them in the chat, and you can look forward to those being shared again in our follow-up email to you. And before we move forward, just want to say that we're going to hold some Q&A at the end, so feel free to use that, drop into the Q&A function and drop them in, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can at the end. Before we go on, we would love to do a poll. So what we want to know is on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do you feel about identifying and implementing digital accessibility and inclusive communications practices? And we'll just give it a little second here before we move on for people. So far, 2 and 3 are kind of neck and neck. Who will be the winner? Who's to say? But it seems like what we're seeing so far is that there's some beginning to intermediate knowledge of this, but we'll give it just another, I see that we have 104 submissions, so that's pretty good. But anyway, so I'm going to close it for now so we can move forward. Thank you everyone who participated. So yes, so you'll see that we had about 35% of folks, 40 of you who said you're about at a 2, and another 48 of you, or 42%, say that they're at about a 3 or mid-level of understanding of these principles. Thank you for sharing. Okay, now I'm going to pass it off to Ayana.
Wonderful. So just a brief overview of what we'll be going through today. We'll start by actually defining inclusive communications and digital accessibility, so we're all on the same page. And then I'll jump into the inclusive comms portion. I'll talk a bit about several aspects of using our language, such as person-first and identity-first language, appropriate terminology, pronouns, clear language, and then a piece on ethical storytelling. And then I'll pass it off to Tina and Jessica, who will tell you more about digital accessibility. And they're going to touch on some topics including assistive technology, social media, email, graphics, and websites. And we'll have some time for at the end for Q&A, so keep your questions. Yeah, so just jumping into some quick definitions. Of course, there's a ton of overlap between inclusive communications and digital accessibility. We think they're so deeply intertwined. But just so that we can all be on the same page, today we're using the blanket term inclusive communications to refer to effective communications practices that are respectful, accurate, accessible, and relevant to all.
All right, and so for digital accessibility, we're defining it here as tools and technology that is put into place to allow a wide range of users to easily navigate, access, and use websites and digital spaces. An example of this is actually how we set up this webinar, and I'll actually just jump in and describe some of the steps we've taken to ensure that the website or webinar is accessible. So with webinars, here are some things that can be implemented to make them more accessible. First of all, slowing down. Conversations can be challenging to follow, especially when there's also slides to read. So being cognizant of that is really important. Next is to share webinar recordings, slides, and other materials with participants for people to revisit. We do this to make sure that the content that we go over here today is accessible for people and is shared in a format that allows folks to go over the materials at their own pace. So to answer some of the questions in the chat right now, we will be sharing these materials after the webinar, and it will be recorded as well. Describe images and graphs in your slides. This is especially helpful for folks that may be low vision to know what kind of visual aids are being used in the presentation. In combination with that, it's also helpful to self-describe. At the beginning of a presentation, you may have noticed that Jessica, Ayana, and I described ourselves during our intros. This just allows for the audience to get an idea of who's presenting, especially if they are low vision or vision impaired. Enabling the closed captioning or transcript features on Zoom or whatever platform the webinar is hosted on. This allows folks to engage in the webinar in different ways and more easily follow along with what the speakers are saying. One note here is that we have enabled closed captioning on this presentation, and we have learned that the captions where they show up, they may at times interfere with or cut off the slide content. So one thing that is possible to do if you have enabled closed captioning is to open up the transcript. In the options at the bottom under captions, there's like a little caret. If you click on that, there's a transcript, and you can open up that in a side panel, and that won't get in the way of the interfere with the slides. And then finally, find out if interpreters are needed for your session by asking in the registration form or on any promotional materials if any sort of interpreter is needed, and if so, invite interpreters as panelists and spotlight them in the session. So as we go through this webinar, we'll be doing our best to abide by all of these principles. That being said, there's a lot that we're still learning, and we're not perfect. So if there is at any point in time that we're speaking too quickly, we encourage you to flag for us in the chat, and we will adjust accordingly.
Great, thank you so much, Tina. So I'm going to start us off with the inclusive communications portion of this webinar. And once again, all of this info and a lot more can be found in the River Network Inclusive Comms Guide. I also just want to acknowledge my own positionality and make it clear that I am very much not an expert in any way. I would say I'm really learning alongside you all. And most of this information was synthesized from a variety of wonderful sources and creators and other organizations, which are all credited in the River Network resource. And really, I would love to hear from you and start a dialogue. So if you have any questions or feedback, I'm going to leave contact information at the end. So starting with some changes that we can make to make our language more inclusive, I'll dive in with person and identity first language. So these are different ways to discuss disability. Some people prefer person first language, which would be saying something like a person with a disability or a person who is deaf, because it emphasizes that a person isn't defined by their disability. Some other folks prefer what we call identity first or proud language, which really centers their identity. And that would be saying a disabled person or a deaf person. The bottom line is it's always important to ask someone about their preferences before making any assumptions or discussing their identities. Next, I'm going to go through a few ways we can approach appropriate terminology. So first, avoiding racialized metaphors and other identity-based language that may negatively portray certain groups or people. So for instance, instead of using the word blacklisted, saying banned, instead of we stand with, we support, and instead of saying, wow, that's crazy, you can say that's wild. Next, to interrogate the origins and usage of popular phrases. I think this one can be a little sneaky. I recently learned that the phrases long time no see and no can do both originated as phrases to mock the speech of Asian immigrants and Indigenous people. So it's important to be mindful of how our language choices are framing who and what we're communicating with. Next, to replace any culturally appropriative language. So not using terms like spirit animal or powwow if they are taken out of context or if they're not culturally relevant or appropriate. And to generally always capitalize Black, Native, and Indigenous. And also just to always ask someone how they prefer to be referred, whether you're discussing their racial identity, their cultural identity. It's important to always ask first. Yeah, next, pronouns. You'll notice that Jessica, Tina, and I all have our pronouns in our Zoom name. You can change that by going to the participants, and then you can click on yourself and change your name. But it's important to ask for people's pronouns and include their pronouns, usually in parentheses, when you first mention them in a caption or an image description or a text post. But something big to note here too is that it's really good to clearly communicate the intended audience when you're asking someone for their pronouns so that folks can decide what pronoun usage feels safest for them in that particular context. Gendered language, trying to avoid language that defaults to a gender binary. So for instance, instead of saying chairman, trying chairperson, instead of ladies and gentlemen, using language like esteemed guests. Okay, now I'm going to touch on a few points that fall under clear language and clarity. So first, we want to clearly introduce any acronyms before we reference them. Even if you think my target audience really knows what this acronym means, there's always a chance that someone doesn't or that someone needs a refresher. So this is a screenshot from a River Network resource where you can see that we spell out the acronym EPA stands for the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Another thing is to use simpler vocabulary and shorter sentences for clarity, and to stay away from any idioms or figures of speech that might be confusing. So for example, last month we just had a blue moon, but instead of saying once in a blue moon, you could say something like once every few months, once every few years. It also helps with clarity, right? It gets to the point. And this is a screenshot of one of the tools that we reference in the River Network guide. There's a lot more tools that accompany these points, but I'm just highlighting this one in particular. It's a web app called the Hemingway app. And it's like this text editor that you can copy paste or type any text into, and it will tell you if your language is too complicated or if you're using passive voice, which I'll talk about a bit more, or if your sentences are too long. So in this screenshot, there's a section of text that's highlighted in red. And this is because the sentence is a little too long and a little too complicated. It reads, the parameters of your responsibility are included in the job description you received on your initial day of work at the association. That's a little long-winded for anyone who's just trying to get to the point. So instead, you can say something like, your job description lists your responsibilities. You got your job description the first day you worked here. And in this screenshot, it shows that the Hemingway app didn't red highlight that second option because it was much more concise and clear. Next, to avoid using jargon, slang, or any technical terminology, unless two things. One, it's necessary to convey information, and two, that language is really clearly introduced. So here is a screenshot from another River Network resource where we talk about what does it mean to, in quotes, attain a use. And this was referring to some legislative language in the Clean Water Act that is talking about uses for bodies of water. And since this jargon was unavoidable, it was something that needed to be referenced. We provided an explanation for what that means and how to engage with that language. And finally, to use sections and subsections to break down large chunks of text and logically present information. So this is a screenshot where information is both visually and conceptually broken down into several sections. So first there's an introductory paragraph under the main heading, and then there's a bulleted subsection with its own heading. And then to the right, there's a call-out box with a green background that visually differentiates that section. And subsections are really wonderful for breaking down large chunks of text to be more digestible. And this doesn't just apply to graphic design or layout. This can also mean, for example, in a social media caption, not squishing everything into one giant block of text and instead breaking things up as you organize them by point. And last thing here, to use active voice instead of passive voice. So passive voice is when there's no subject and it's not clear who's doing the action. So for instance, a sentence with passive voice might read like, fish are depended on as a vital and sacred source of food. And in this sentence, it's unclear who's depending on the fish. Whereas if we put in a subject, now it can become communities depend on fish as a vital and sacred source of food. And this is actually another screenshot from the Hemingway app. And the Hemingway app also identifies passive voice. So in this screenshot, the passive language is highlighted in green. And in the section that doesn't have passive voice, there's no highlighting. So it's another great way to use that resource to check your language. Okay, so that was more on the language side of things. Now I'm going to pivot a bit and get into some aspects of ethical storytelling. Once again, there's a lot more on this in the River Network guide, but I wanted to share a few guiding principles. And this is really particularly relevant for anyone who is regularly sharing stories, such as from the communities you work with or interviewing folks. So first, it's really important to move at the speed of trust. Not just dropping in on folks when you need a story, because that can feel very extractive or transactional, but to build a relationship before asking for someone's story. And also, I think this part gets overlooked a bit more, to stay in touch with storytellers afterwards and to continue to maintain a relationship. So for instance, like, let's say you have an interview with somebody and you publish that interview on a website and it stays up there indefinitely. Maybe in a year, that person who was sharing that story no longer feels comfortable with having that interview publicly available on that website. When you have a continued relationship, the storyteller has a lot more continued agency over when and how they share their story, because that enables them to feel more comfortable reaching out. So maybe they could reach out and communicate that desire to remove the interview from your page. Next, to always prioritize the storyteller's needs, once again, to avoid making this feel extractive. It's important to ask why the storyteller is interested in sharing their story or what they might hope to get out of the experience, and to prioritize this or these desires above any personal or organizational motivations. And next, this is a big one, to acknowledge and actively disrupt power dynamics. So we really want to consider how the interviewer's positionality, this could be you, will impact the storyteller's sense of comfort, openness, and formality. So when I talk about positionality, that means all the identities that you're carrying with you into a room. So for instance, let's say someone who is going to be interviewing the storyteller hold several degrees, and maybe the person who is going to be sharing their story did not go to college. So that storyteller might experience a power dynamic, and they might feel less comfortable sharing. So it's really important to explicitly name those dynamics, and to also consider who might be best suited to having a conversation with the person you're hoping to hear stories from. And to emphasize that there's no expectations beyond whatever the storyteller feels comfortable or excited about sharing. Next, to always position storytellers as the experts. It's really important to approach these conversations with humility and an expectation of learning. And finally, to compensate storytellers for their time. If you've ever been on this end, you know that storytelling is serious mental and emotional labor and should always be generously compensated. That being said, sometimes financial compensation can feel transactional for some folks and might not be the best way to compensate someone. So that's another reason it's really important to have a strong established relationship with the person you're hearing stories from, because that way they can share, or you can understand how you might be able to compensate them in a way that feels meaningful and comfortable. And the last thing I'll say here is these are some key words that describe how a storyteller should feel during a conversation. So trusted, benefited, represented, connected, and compensated. And these are, this is from a Water Hub resource, which is a great resource for visual storytelling. It's linked here, and I would definitely recommend for y'all to check out that resource afterwards. And so to conclude, yes, definitely visit these resources for more information. There's also a lot more on ethical storytelling in the River Network guide, including how to prepare for a conversation, how to navigate things during, and also how to do that strong relationship building afterwards. So if this portion felt relevant to you, definitely check that out. And then that concludes the inclusive comms portion. So I'm going to pass it over to Tina and Jessica to tell you more about digital accessibility.
Thanks so much, Ayana. So I just want to also restate that I am still learning with you all, and really excited to share some of these best practices with you. And if I miss anything, please feel free to chime in. Or if you have more questions, I may not have the answer off the top of my head, but we'll make sure that we support you to the best of our ability as we move forward. So let's dive into the digital piece. In this section, we're going to cover some common types of assistive technology people use to navigate online, plus some best practices for social, email design, graphics, and websites. So let's start with the types of technology people use, or assistive technology as it's called, because this is relevant to think about as you're developing content and how it can interface with these tools that folks rely on to make their lives easier. So I'm just going to walk us through some examples. One that's a biggie is screen readers. So this is a type of software that converts digital text and images into audible speech, like out loud, for people who have low vision. Some popular tools include NVDA, which is otherwise known as non-visual desktop access, and another app called VoiceOver, which helps with Apple devices, both on iOS and Mac OS. Another tool that actually works in tandem with screen readers is something called a Braille display. So this is a piece of hardware or a tool that people have that will actually transcribe the content into Braille by raising or lowering pins, and it works with a screen reader so that people who are blind and read Braille can still engage with your content. Another tool that folks with low vision or vision impairment use is something called a screen magnifier. This enlarges the content of on a screen so that folks can zoom in, and it's easier for them to read if they still have the ability to do that. And so Zoom Text is a good example of one tool that people use. And then lastly, again, this is not exhaustive and I'm still learning, but switch access devices, this is another type of hardware per se, where these are switches, buttons, and sensors that people who have mobility issues or fine motor skill challenges can use to navigate through a page. For example, using a foot or their head or even their mouth. So with website design, it's really important to make sure, and Tina will go into this into more detail, to make this easy for people to tab through sections of content for people who have switch access devices. And then now, just wanted to do some broad strokes on digital accessibility, some tips that go across channels. Number one is, you'll hear us say this again and again in this section, but alternative text, otherwise known as alt text. This touches social, your graphics, email design, your website, and even in this presentation. So for example, you see here on the right, there's a GIF of a crystal ball, and in the middle, it says the future is accessible with a swirling pattern that's animated behind it. When I was developing, this deck, and with Ayana and Tina, we made sure to alt text every single one of the images in here, so that when a screen reader is going through the deck, it will pick up the text. Now, to do that in the context of this, you would right-click the image, and there's a field that, you can select alt text. So this is, for screen readers, so that when they encounter an image, it will read it out loud, the description, so that people can understand the content and context of an image and not feel left out or miss some important information. Another tip that goes across channels and content is to use sans serif font when you can. That means like choosing Arial or over Times New Roman. It is more legible for people. And while it might feel tempting sometimes to get really frilly with your fonts, it really leaves some folks behind because it's a little bit too busy, right? Hard for them to read, not legible. So simple is best when you're selecting your typography and your designs and your communications. Another one that's going to bleed through a few, slides and pieces that we'll be discussing today is color contrast. So this is important, again, for people to be able to read text against a colored background, or, some folks are even, it's something to account for when people are colorblind, for example, to make sure there's adequate color contrast as well in your graphic imagery. So we will be dropping a link to a color contrast checker, and it's also included in the guide. Both of our guides, I believe, will have resources for sure on types of, resources that you can rely on to make sure that you're checking your content before it goes live. And lastly, as Ayana said, it's important to try to use plain and accessible language whenever you can to make people feel like they can be invited into the work and we're not raising the bar to entry. So next, let's talk social. This is, for many of us, this is a daily habit, practice that we're scrolling through our feeds, which is why it's really important for folks to feel like they can be part of our campaign conversations regardless of their ability. So we'll go through some tips here. On the left, as I mentioned earlier with the alt text, it's showing up right away, and here we are. So anytime you have a photo or a graphic on your social post, make sure you have alt text. So here on the left of the slide, you'll see a post that we published for Groundwater Awareness Week. And the alt text is shown. If you click on the bottom left corner of it, you'll see it, so that when a screen reader encounters it, people can understand the graphic. And so what this says and what the graphic looks like, just for context, is that this is an illustration that shows a green city parkway that's recharging groundwater beneath it during a rain event. And the graphic text reads, quote, "Groundwater is renewable. We have to use it wisely and work with nature to catch rainwater where it falls." Another example of digital accessibility, as we live more and more in a video-first digital world, is to make sure that your social videos have captions embedded in them. whether it's your TikTok, your Instagram Reel, your YouTube videos, etc. So an example here on the right is a clip from a partnership that we actually did recently to raise awareness for the Inflation Reduction Act with an influencer whose name is Guy Waden. They are a water protector from Minnesota. So you'll see in this clip that they are sitting under a tree and they're saying to camera, quote, two statements I hope that we can all agree with is that water is life and water is a human right. Something that would make this a little more legible in retrospect would be to include a background behind the white text so it's a little easier to read. And again, like this, like including captions is helpful for not just people who might want to have their sound off as they're scrolling, but also for folks who have hearing issues so that they can also enjoy your content. Some do's and don'ts for social. This is not exhaustive, but include, to the left here, you'll see a draft post with a series of hand clapping emojis in it. And while myself included, I can fall victim to wanting to get a little bit overboard with my emoji use as the effusive person I am, try to bridle your excitement. And so what happens is because screen readers will read the description of the emoji every time that they come through it, it can be pretty cumbersome for people who rely on screen readers. So for example, this emoji would read, quote, emoji colon clapping hand sign. So every time the emoji came up, the screen reader would say that between the text. So you can get lost in the message essentially, or the message can get lost rather. Another tip, some do's and tips are to capitalize the first letter of every word in a hashtag. This is called camel casing. It helps hashtags be more legible for people. And on the right, you'll see a post that the Water Hub did during Water Week and tried to kind of encompass this as an example of some best practices. For example, we tried to make the language pretty accessible and how the copy was written. It uses fairly simple language. It also includes camel case hashtag. And we also included alt text. You'll see on the bottom left, there's that alt that shows that there is alt text there. And lastly, we tried to incorporate some high contrast in the design. And while, we're still learning, we tried to make it pop so that people can see it. So now for graphics. We should try to be as intentional as we can with our graphic design as a movement to be inclusive and to convey our message in an easy way for people to get on board and take action. And it bears repeating that again, like color contrast, it's coming up again. Make sure you have adequate color contrast when you can, and try to make your design simple when possible and not too text heavy, and try to lean into the use of negative space. This helps make the image a little bit easier to digest. It creates a sense of spaciousness and not as much overwhelm should there be too much information or copy or busyness in the design. So you'll see here on the left, there's another graphic that we created for Groundwater Awareness Week again. And we worked with our designer to tell a story using simple imagery and copy that's easy to understand without jargon. So the image is a winding river going through a valley with some mountains in the background. And there are some people on the riverbank planting some native trees, and it shows an aquifer beneath their feet. So trying to tell the story of how groundwater is sometimes invisible, but right beneath us, and the things that we can do to take care of it. And the text is the same as the last one because it was a series, and which read again, if you can't see, it's, quote, groundwater is renewable. We have to work wisely with nature to make sure that we catch rain where it falls. Another tip for graphics is to try and use vector files when you can. These retain their image quality no matter how you size them. So those file types can look like a .ai or a .eps or an SVG file. So, you know, a JPEG you might notice when you have a JPEG and say you want to, you know, expand it for a presentation or a flyer and it gets kind of blurry or pixelated. That won't happen if you're working with vector files. It helps with legibility. So for example, if you work with Canva, we recommend that you download the asset as an SVG file. And then lastly, on design, and before I pass it over to Tina, some logo design tips. So I just wanted to give a shout out to River Network because they have a great logo design. It shows a few of the principles that we've been talking throughout this conversation about. One is it's sans serif font, right? It's also bold, like it's, you know, nice and legible, the text and the font that they chose. There's enough color contrast because it's a darker blue. And then the icon itself is pretty simple, like it's not too busy. And so it conveys the ethos of the organization. It is fairly simple and easy to understand. So wanted to give a nod to them for their logo. And now I'm going to pass it off to Tina, who is our resident SEO, CRM, and data whiz at Climate Nexus, and will be walking you through the other set of slides for us in the digital section.
Thanks, Jessica. I don't know if I deserve all of that praise, but I will do my best to touch on these next couple of pieces here. So for many of us, email is a core part of how we engage with our audiences. So it's really important that we design emails in a way that's accessible for everyone. On the slide here, we have a screenshot of an example email in the center of the slide that follows the principles that I'll be going over now. You'll notice a lot of these are pretty similar to the ones that Jessica has already gone over. A lot of these principles just apply across the board to digital tools or digital assets. So first off, we want to make sure that the email is as readable as possible. Some things that we can do to help ensure this is to make sure the text in the email is left justified or left aligned. Left aligned text just maintains consistent character and word spacing in a way that, for instance, center justified or right justified text may not. Additionally, and again, sans serif fonts are easier to read, so trying to stick to those types of fonts whenever possible. Some examples of readily available fonts across platforms, whether that's Google Docs, Microsoft Word, any sort of tool that you may be using, are Arial and Roboto. Those are typically available to fonts that are easily found and available on these platforms. And then finally, color contrast is also important, especially if there is text over a colored background. We want to make sure that there's enough contrast between the text and the background so that it pops and makes the text easier to read. Next, we want to make sure that the subject line is clear so that the user will know what the email is about. So in the example here, we have the subject at the very top is saying, asking for a social share, burning gas to cook creates high concentrations of benzene. And then moving on to the body of the email, if there are links, using descriptive links are important so that users will know what type of content they will be navigating to if they click on the link. So in this email here, we have a couple of links here at the bottom. Right before these buttons, we have a sentence that says, please amplify this content by sharing a post from this social pack with the text, this social pack being hyperlinked. So users know if they click on that hyperlink, it'll take them to the social pack for this particular study that was released. Lastly, it's generally best practice to avoid using GIFs and to stick to static imageries and graphics instead. There are some parameters that you can work within if you're going to be using GIFs, but generally the fact that the GIFs are looping in nature, it can be triggering for folks with any sort of photosensitivity or seizure disorder. So we typically try to avoid using GIFs when possible. This next section will be going over website accessibility. In this slide here, we have a graphic of a computer monitor that's shown scrolling through a website. And, you know, websites or web apps are one of the main ways in which people navigate and interact with the digital world. So we like to follow the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are guidelines that were created by the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium. This is a global community of accessibility experts that are striving to make the internet as inclusive as possible. One little tidbit of facts is that as of September 2021, only about 2% of internet websites met the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines AA standard. So there's definitely still a lot of work to be done to make the internet more accessible to everybody. On top of that, accessibility benefits all users, not just those with disabilities. Studies have shown that websites with better accessibilities have improved user satisfaction and have increased conversion rates. Additionally, applying good accessible website design also helps with search engine optimization, or SEO, which in turn makes it easier for websites to be found via search engines like Google, Bing, and other search engines. That being said, many of the same digital accessibility principles that we've already gone over for social media, graphics, and email apply to websites as well. So using alt text on any images, descriptive hyperlinks, making sure that assets are mobile compatible, that there's enough color contrast, using left justified text, and then using sans serif fonts are all things that should be used when designing a website. Besides the more designy aspects that I just mentioned on the last slide, an important aspect of making a website accessible is how pages are organized. It's best practice to use headers when organizing a page, as they can help users get a sense of how the page is organized, and can benefit those who are using screen readers or other assistive technology as well. In addition to helping with the website SEO, or search engine optimization, like I mentioned in the last slide. We can think of the heading structure kind of like a table of contents for a web page, or the table of contents on a academic paper, for instance. Using headings properly also allows users of screen readers, along with search engines, to easily get a sense of how a page is broken up or structured, and be able to skip to any sections that are relevant to them. They can do this by using headings. So websites utilize heading tags, as we call them, and they go from 1 through 6 with, when structuring a website, headings should be nested by their rank or importance. So H1s on a website is the most important, followed by, and then H6 is the least important. So one thing to keep in mind, with each page on a website, they should only have one H1 tag, and that tag is typically used to describe the contents of the page as a whole. Another thing to keep in mind is to avoid skipping heading ranks. This is because screen readers will go through headings chronologically. So if we have an H2 heading, and then our next heading is an H4, then the screen reader will actually skip the H4, the content under that altogether, because it's looking for an H3 next. So it'll go from H2 to the next H2 instead of reading the content of that H4. So on our slide here, I have an example of what a potential page structure would look like if the contents of this webinar were translated into a web page. So we have utilized one H1 here, which is the title of this presentation. And then it goes into H2s as the broad categories that we have been talking about. And then the H3s are kind of nested under those H2s as subcategories. So that's kind of how we want to structure our pages and use headings. One thing to keep in mind if designing a website is to not use headings solely for aesthetic purposes, right? Some internet or web page tools like Squarespace or Wix, they have when you're designing and formatting text, it has drop downs where you can select headings, and it can be easy to really use a heading as a way to format it visually. But just these best practices and the chronological aspect of heading structures are things to keep in mind when designing a website. And then here are some other considerations when designing a website for accessibility. The first one here is to include an HTML sitemap somewhere on the website. An HTML sitemap is a clickable list of all of the pages that are contained on a website. Having one that is easily found, whether that's in, typically they're found in like the footers of a website, but having one that's easily found allows users to navigate to that sitemap and easily find the content that they're looking for. This is especially important if a site has a lot of pages or complex navigation. So on the right here, there is a screenshot of the River Network's HTML sitemap. It essentially looks like a table of contents, and much like how individual websites' page structure, heading structure acts as a table of contents for that specific page. So the sitemap acts as a table of contents for the website as a whole. And lastly is readability. We keep saying this in all aspects of inclusive communications and digital accessibility. Those same principles apply to websites as well. So making sure the site is easily readable and digestible is important for the user experience. So as much as possible, avoid writing content that is too jargony and dense. And yeah, I think I'm passing it back to Jessica to close us out.
Thanks so much, Tina. And thank you everyone for your active chat questions and your Q&A questions. I've already learned a lot, seeing character limit suggestions for alt text and some other questions and things I've even noticed of what we could do differently in the future, like sharing slides in advance instead of just after, so that folks can follow along more easily. So thank you for your engagement so far. But yes, now we have a bit of time for Q&A, and then we'd also love for you to take the time, if you're still here with us, to fill out the survey that Sarah will drop in the chat. I encourage you all to do it while you're listening and while we're all here together. Yeah, we can go through some of our questions. So I see, again, thank you, Laura, for the suggestion and question about for accessibility to share our slides in advance. You're right. It does make it easier for people to follow along if you share materials both in advance and after. We did share our guides because they're pretty hefty, and we will share them after, but we'll follow that in the future. I also see from Renee, about interested in learning more about other types of compensation for storytelling alternatives aside from monetary, and if you might have any examples of that.
Yeah, I can jump in for that. I think it really just depends case by case on the scale of the storytelling that was exchanged, the nature of the relationship. But I feel like I've been thinking so much lately about gift economies and what it means to give back to someone in a way that isn't like a check. I think this is a lot easier too when there's more of a local relationship too. Like I think about what it would mean to maybe like go support that person with using your time and energy at an event they're hosting, or to volunteer with their organization, or if you know that they are a really big reader, like sending them a few books that you think they would really enjoy. I think it's really dependent on that interpersonal relationship, and I think it's just really exciting to think more expansively about how to give back in a way that doesn't make someone feel like they just, you know, like gave you something in exchange for money. I think that can make some people feel uncomfortable, but also for some people, like that is what they would prefer. So again, it's really case by case, very interpersonal, very relational, but I encourage y'all to think about that more, and I will be too.
Thanks, Ayana. I'm also looking in the chat, and I see from Erin, they asked, what are the benefits of descriptive hyperlinks versus saying click here or learn more here? So I can start, and maybe Tina, you can jump in if I missed anything, but essentially, when you're using, like, some people rely on keyboards to navigate a website, and sometimes they can you can collect a set of hyperlinks on a page, and some people will rely on technology that will just collate all of the hyperlinks on a page. And if it just says click here, they might have a list of 5 that say click here, click here, click here. But if they're kind of indexing it all, it's helpful if you're hyperlinking in more clarity, like, learn about the digital accessibility guide and hyperlinking that, or, the latest on, the Inflation Reduction Act news and hyperlinking that. That way, if people have it in a list, it's easier for them to tab through and find. So that's what I understand. Did I miss anything, Tina?
Nope, you got it. Hit the nail on the head.
Nice. I also saw from Abu that some websites appear different on your computer versus on mobile devices. And the obvious difference being the screen size, but often the layout can change significantly, and wanted to know tips on resolving the issue. And I would love to pass this to Tina, because it's not necessarily an issue per se, as it is like mobile responsiveness, and maybe you can walk us through what that means.
Yeah, I will be the first to say and purport that I don't know all the back end coding that goes into making a website mobile responsive. But I will say, if you're structuring your website the way that when I went over that slide, that does help, even with even though it might not appear very aesthetically on the mobile site, if you follow those principles, especially with the site HTML, a screen reader or those mobile or accessibility devices should still be able to parse through the page content without any issues. That being said, for easy reading, that is an issue, and that's more goes into formatting specifically based on viewports. And that's something that we would want to, talk to your website developer about. A lot of the tools like Squarespace and Wix have a mobile editing interface. So making sure to check both the browser experience and the mobile experience, if you're designing a website that way, is also helpful. But there's a lot of different screen sizes, so it's not necessarily always going to translate. And yeah, those are just some things to keep in mind. As I said, I'm not a developer, so I don't know all the technical terms for that, but some things that can help on the mobile side.
Thanks, Tina, and thanks, Alyssa and Caroline, for dropping in some follow-ups on there. But yeah, essentially, different screens, there's going to be, like, websites now should be resized and will reformat based on if you're on a tablet or a phone. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's actually not a bad thing. But it is something to keep in mind as you're designing your site, to kind of with the hierarchy of information in the design. I'm glad we're getting some love in the chat. Thank you so much. We're learning. Let's see. We have 3 minutes. I'm just going through some of these. Alyssa, so Allie, would you consider FAQ pages and a glossary of terms page as helpful or accessible sections on a website? I can speak just from my experience. Like, for example, I worked at an organization that focused on urban and mountain forestry and stormwater capture and environmental education here in LA for a while. And we definitely had an FAQ page because there was a lot of dendrology and nerdy terms that were floating around, and tree benefit, pages. And, we definitely would have benefited from a sitemap. But our FAQ page, I kid you not, was one of the most trafficked pages on our website. because, you know, people were searching for the information, a lot of keywords in there. So I think, you know, especially, you know, we may not want to think it, but the water is wonky. And so the more we can make it easy to understand, and if you're working a lot in policy or some other science-based field, please, yeah, please don't hesitate to put in an FAQ page. That's my experience. Let's see here. Of course. We are almost at time. Let's see here. There are some questions about other resources that we can share, about if there are tools that you can embed on a web page to make it more accessible to read out the, let me see here, wondering if you can share any resources or tools that will read out an email or a web page that can be embedded in a website or email. I can't tell you off the top of my head. If anyone else here has any names at their fingertips, if not, we can review our resources and include that in our blog roundup, because that's a good question. Or you can email us and we'll get back to you. I just wanted to name that we saw your question. Wonderful. We're at time. Thank you everyone so much. Let's see here. I'm glad to hear, Laura, that it was helpful also for you to learn how to share slides before an event. Andrea, I see your question too in terms of language access and if there's a better tool than Google Translate. Thank you for asking. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get back to you. I have your email and I can respond and share. Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. Please plug the survey. Are there, let's see here. Paul, I hear you. There was a lot of information to take in here. We did our best to try to keep it high level, but appreciate that. We will be sharing the resources again. We invite people to share their thoughts and honesty in the survey. And also we'll share some top level, easy, you know, to scan takeaways in a blog post as well. Wonderful. Also hearing a question about, I mean, we have quite a few questions in here and we may not be able to answer them all and we're all signing off, but also want to name that someone asked about different forms of neurodivergence and how that can impact digital accessibility, or if we have any resources for that. And we can also include that in our FAQ section. In fact, why not include an FAQ in the blog roundup? So anyway, thank you so much for everyone's questions and time. We're 2 minutes past. We had a great day with you all, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever have questions.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. It was great to have you all here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us and learning with us and growing with us.